Assalamu alaikum. Today I'm going to share with you a very critical part of the methodology that I follow, starting with a very critical word or expression that the Quran uses in a very unique way, and yet, unfortunately, like other words we've discussed before, was misunderstood by most translators and commentators on the Quran before. That word is min dunillah. Min dunillah. The real meaning of it, as we shall see, is with intermediaries between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and mankind. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He uses that word or that expression in the Quran, He's warning us against having intermediaries. Now, we're going to prove this using the methodology that I extracted from the Quran itself, as we shall see. We're going to start with a very critical principle of this methodology. According to this methodology, one of the purposes of the stories, the Quranic stories, is to set a context for defining specific terms and expressions. And we're going to see as an example in Surah Maryam, verse number 17, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing a scene where Maryam alayhi salam, Jesus' mother, went away from her people, trying to hide the fact that she was pregnant because she's afraid. And she's getting to a point where she's close to deliver baby Jesus. And the Quran describes the scene as فَاتَّخَذَتْ مِن دُونِهِمْ حِجَابًا. She placed between her and her people a separating partition. There was some sort of partition, either natural partition like trees or a mountain or a hill, or she found a place where there was a separation between her and her people. And the word used in this scene is min dunihim, min dunihim. And the word hijab means a partition or a separation or something that hides. The second example is from Surah Al-Kahf, which is Surah number 18, verse number 90. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us the story of a leader called Dhul Qarnayn. We don't know exactly who that person was, but we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned him by his descriptive nickname, sort of. Dhul Qarnayn, the one with the two horns. There are many theories about who that person is, none of them confirmed according to the Quran, but according to the Quran it doesn't really matter. He's not describing the person, he's describing his actions and his deeds. One of the scenes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes that scene as follows: حتى إذا بلغ مطلع الشمس وجدها تطلع على قوم لم نجعل لهم من دونها سترا. And then he marched until when he reached the time of sunrise, he found that it was rising on a people for whom we had provided no shelter between them and the sun. Now, several points we need to make here. First point is that most translators and commentators unfortunately describe this scene as he actually arrived at the physical, geographical location where the sun actually rises. Their mental framework was that the earth was flat and that the sun actually rises from a very specific point close to the edge of the earth. And of course we know that that's not true. So they interpreted the word matli'a shamsi as the physical location, and that's not true, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses in this verse the verb balagha. Balagha is very often, mostly in the Quran, described with a timing situation. The word balagha gives us a clear hint that this is a timing. So balagha matli'a shamsi, he reached the time of sunrise. In other words, he was traveling all through the night and he found a group of people who did not have shelter against the sun. In other words, who did not have something to protect them from the sun. The Quran describes that scene, the protection from the sun, as وَجَدَهَا تَطْلُعُ عَلَى قَوْمٍ لَمْ نَجْعَلْ لَهُم مِّن دُونِهَا سِتْرًا. And you find it circled in the slide you're watching. مِن دُونِهَا, between them and the sun. They did not have between them and the sun any shelter, any protective insulation. And therefore, the expression min dun is very clear in the Quran as defined within these stories. And as we said, according to the methodology, these stories set the context so that we fix the exact meaning. Now, why is that important? And this is the genius of the Quran, the unprecedented miracle of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knew that the language itself contains expressions that change in their meanings over time, over millennia and centuries. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to protect the exact meanings that He described using these terms. And therefore He set these terms within a story context. Within the story context, the scene is clear, the context is very clear and fixed. If you read it today, if you read it 1,000 years from now, or you read it 10,000 years from now, you will understand. In the case of story of Maryam, is using min dunihim, between her and them and her people. It's very clear that there is a separation between her and them. The context is very clear, and therefore the expression min dun is an intermediary, something between A and B. Now, why is this important? Because we will see that it's applied in over 140 verses of the Quran. It is unfortunate that in all of these verses, this expression has been misinterpreted. So instead of an intermediary type of interpretation, all of the interpreters and the translators chose to interpret it either as aside from Allah, meaning instead of Allah, or beside Allah, with Allah. And both of those are wrong, because the proper interpretation, as we saw from these stories, is between a human being and Allah, or between A and B, min dun. Now, we will see the serious impact of misinterpreting this expression. We start with Surah Ar-Ra'd, number 13, verse number 16. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ مَنْ رَبُّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ قُلِ اللَّهُ قُلْ أَفَاتَّخَذْتُم مِّن دُونِهِ أَوْلِيَاءَ لَا يَمْلِكُونَ لِأَنفُسِهِمْ نَفْعًا وَلَا ضَرًّا. Say, who is the Lord of the heavens and the earth? Say, Allah. Then say, why then do you allow between you and Allah self-appointed representatives who cannot benefit themselves, nor can they harm themselves? In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, if you admit that the Lord of the heavens and the earth is Allah, the one Lord, the single God, if you really truly believe this, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent you this scripture to engage directly with Him, why then do you accept intermediaries? Somebody who self-appoints himself or herself to represent what Allah is trying to say. And this proves what we have been saying on many different occasions in segments of this channel, that the Quran speaks for itself. The Quran is an instrument where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses you directly, engages you directly, if you have the right conditions, if you portray the right certainty in the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore Allah in this verse is saying, why then do you allow between you and Allah self-appointed representatives, meaning people who appointed themselves as spokespeople for Allah, as delegates for Allah, as chosen as if they're better than anybody else, who cannot benefit themselves nor can they harm. This is the first example. In another example in Surah Al-Imran, which is number 3, verse number 79, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala goes even further to stress this point. Not even prophets and messengers are allowed to place themselves in such position. Listen to this beautiful verse. ما كان لبشر أن يؤتيه الله الكتاب والحكم والنبوة ثم يقول للناس كونوا عبادا لي من دون الله. It is not befitting a human being to receive from Allah the book, the faculty to determine, and the prophethood, only then to say to people afterwards, be worshippers for me as an intermediary between you and Allah. And this is unfortunately what we see happening among some so-called monotheistic religion. We need to pay attention to these expressions and these terms and cast them in the exact indication that Allah intended for these expressions and terms, not according to the language of the Arabs. Where the Quran interpreters and the translators went wrong in their interpretation of this expression is that they relied on the typical use of the Arabs for such a word or for such an expression. They did not understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala defined such terms in the Quranic stories context to fix them for good, so that they don't slip and so that we don't have to guess. And that's why we say the Quran is self-explaining if we pay attention, especially if we pay attention to the Quranic stories. And that's part of our methodology. Now we see a third verse just to confirm the exact same concept in Surah Al-A'raf, which is chapter 7, verse number 3. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is confirming, اتبعوا ما أنزل إليكم من ربكم ولا تتبعوا من دونه أولياء قليلا ما تذكرون. Follow that which has been made accessible to you from your Lord, and do not follow as intermediaries between you and Allah self-appointed representatives, people who claim they can speak on behalf of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said. How little do you remember? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is closing this verse with a reminder that at the end we will forget. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used this expression directly in either a form of min dunillah, between you and Allah, or min dunir rahman, between you and ar-Rahman, which is one of the nouns to describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or min dunihi, meaning between you and Him, between you and Allah. And that's frowned upon by the Quran in over 140 verses. That's how important this expression is. Conclusion for this segment, we're going to apply this concept now in novel ways so that we see how we learn from the Quran and from this methodology. As I said before, this methodology provides principles and theories, and these theories are proven correct only through prediction. And therefore, they have to predict something new. They have to tell us something new that makes sense, that we can prove from the Quran. Let's look at Surah Yunus in verse number 37. وَمَا كَانَ هَذَا الْقُرْآنُ أَن يُفْتَرَى مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ. It is not possible for this Quran to be concocted, meaning invented or made up, by an intermediary between the recipient, i.e. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and Allah. This is really critical verse, because for the first time, we have a direct verse that tells us directly from within the Quran that this Quran is the composition by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No other verse has been produced with this type of direct evidence from within the Quran. I know some other verses refer to Kalamullah, the speech of Allah, but it's not a direct reference. In this verse right here, Surah Yunus, which is chapter 10, verse number 37, this is a direct evidence. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala proclaiming very clearly that this Quran have been composed, articulated, the exact expressions came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They did not come from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they did not come from any intermediary who delivered the Quran to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, i.e. someone like Archangel Gabriel and so on. As you see, these are some excellent examples of how one expression, min dun, when it's misinterpreted, can lead to so many other things. So there are 140 verses just because of this one expression that have been misinterpreted. Now the final question I'll leave you to reflect on. Why were all of these verses that contain min dunillah, intermediaries who are self-appointed representatives, spokespersons of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, why did all of these verses get misinterpreted in that wrong way? Think about this. Thank you for watching.